Welcome to yet another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and welcome to the show. If you're joining in for the very first time, thank you and welcome. The purpose of this show is anything and everything related to SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery solutions. Although I focus so much on always on availability groups because Microsoft is pushing always on availability groups as kind of like the go-to solution for your SQL Server databases, as if that's the only solution. Sometimes it isn't, right? I'll be sharing lessons learned, tips and tricks, best practices, insights, sometimes mistakes that I've made personally and mistakes that some of my customers have made so that you don't have to make them yourself. Make new ones, if you may, and learn new things and not fall into the trap of making the mistakes that I've already made. That's why I'm sharing some of these with you. I recently started, I don't want to call it a series, but I've recently started a kind of like a topic. So what I did a couple of weeks ago is I sent out a survey to people who have been watching these videos, people who have read my articles on mssqltips.com, my blog, some of the white papers that I've written, people who have been following me for, I don't know, more than a decade now, and asked them what kind of topics do you want me to cover. And the top one that came out, the one that stood out most, has something to do with troubleshooting issues pertaining to always-on availability groups. Excuse me. And it's interesting because troubleshooting issues has become a lost art. Okay. I want to say, and it's just observation, and maybe because of what I see out in the field and the data that I'm seeing, is that the younger generation, and when I mean younger generation, I'm referring to people under 35 years old. And my assumption, I could be wrong, is because of the fact that this generation grew up with mobile devices, their computers connected to the internet. They have easy access to information. And so when they are faced with an issue that they need to troubleshoot, what they would do is they would grab a section of the error message. Let's say they have an issue and they're not personal, a technical issue. They would grab a section, maybe an error number, the message, and put in some keywords, put that in their favorite search engine, Google, Yahoo, if people are using that, Bing, ChatGPT, Perplexity. And these tools would immediately bring them results. And this immediate access to information, because you don't really have to do much, is it kind of diminishes the skills that you need to troubleshoot issues. Okay? It's also as easy as I'll post a question on a forum like Reddit or Stack Exchange or Microsoft Learn. Somebody would post a question and people would start jumping in and provide answers to that question. So again, it kind of diminishes the skills that you need to troubleshoot issues. And I want to focus more on, in this series, and again, I'm not really looking at it as a series, but rather highlighting within the next couple of weeks, highlighting how important troubleshooting is and developing that skill when it comes to troubleshooting issues. And when I mean issues, when it comes to always-on available groups, that could be an emergency situation, what I normally call a 911 situation, where the databases are offline, there is a massive outage, and all hands on deck, let's bring everything back online, versus a normal end user request that may or may not lead to an outage. Okay, like connectivity issues to the database, while the databases are still up and running, that might potentially lead to an outage. So I want to focus more on that because I want to bring the awareness and help people develop their troubleshooting skills. But for this particular topic, I want to zoom in on one of the very first tools that you will be using when you are managing an always-on availability groups, and that is the always-on availability group dashboard. The topic of today's show, hopefully it's on the screen now. Don't blindly trust the always-on availability group dashboard. And like I said, this is the first tool that you will be getting acquainted with the first time you build an always-on availability group. In fact, if you watch YouTube videos, step-by-step tutorials, articles, this is the first thing that you do after building an always-on availability group. And well, it's kind of self-explanatory. You want to validate immediately after building your always-on availability group. And the dashboard will show you whether or not you've done everything correctly. And it does feel good seeing all greens. The thing about this is you will have to look at the dashboard, not just to validate, but to also look at the status of the databases. And before we dive into the topic of today's show, I want to first introduce the dashboard, because sometimes people like look at the dashboard, especially if it's the first time looking at the dashboard, and introduce you to the different sections of the dashboard and how it behaves, so that you will know where I'm coming from when I say don't blindly trust the dashboard. So within the section of the dashboard, and I'm taking screenshots of the dashboard, there are sections of the dashboard that tells you the health of the availability group and the different components of the availability group from the point of view of SQL Server. So first off is the topmost section. Okay, this is the name of the availability group and the current primary replica. Okay, the name of the availability group and the current primary replica. You see there the name of my AG is AG prod. It's currently hosted on TDPRD0221 as my current primary replica. Now here's the thing though, you will not see the availability group dashboard like this unless you are connected to the primary replica. Okay, unless you're connected to the primary replica. What that means is you could connect to the SQL Server instance using the instance name, but that might not be the primary replica, which means you won't see anything like this. You will only see a full picture of the health of the availability group if you're connected to the current primary replica. Okay? The second section over there is the availability group health. Note how it states the health of the availability group, the current primary instance, the one that you're connected to. The failover mode, is that an automatic failover, a manual failover. The cluster state, okay? Here you would see it's the cluster name object if you're running on top of a Windows Server failover cluster with normal quorum, and then the cluster type, which was introduced in SQL Server 2017, Windows Server failover cluster, because with SQL Server on Linux, well, you're not running on Windows Server failover cluster, okay? So that's the availability group health. Next section there is the availability replica health. These are the different replicas, primary and secondary, within this section. So you will see the names of the replicas, the instance names. Then the role, is the primary, is it secondary? What is the availability mode? Is this synchronous commit or asynchronous commit? Failover mode, is it set to automatic or manual? And seeding mode. By the way, every column that you're seeing in the availability group dashboard there by default, you can add, you can remove columns based on your preferences and what's important to you. Next is we have the availability databases health. This is where you would see like the databases that are added to that specific availability group. Where are they as far as replicas are concerned? So you can see I've had them the dashboard has them divided into the replicas and the corresponding databases. Okay, the idea behind the dashboard is they're a roll up, meaning the health of your available, and the green check marks are dictated by what's underneath. So the top, let me go back to the first one. The top level over here is your availability group health. This is either green or red, or sometimes yellow, depending on the states of what's underneath. So this will be green if, rather, no one will be green if the availability group replica health is green. Excuse me. Meaning, if all my availability group replicas are healthy, then by default, my availability group is healthy. As a side effect of that, all my availability group replica is healthy if all of the databases in my replica are healthy. If even one database, let's say you have like 25 or 35 databases in an availability group, and only one database is unhealthy, this section will show that. It will actually tell you which database is unhealthy, and will also tell you, because it's sectioned according to replicas, it will show you which replica is unhealthy. And if you go back here, I did say it's a roll-up, right? It will mark that section as unhealthy based on one replica being unhealthy. And because one replica is unhealthy, it will mark this section as unhealthy. Okay, so it's a roll-up, which makes it easy to identify just looking at the dashboard, making it easy to identify which one is causing the problem, so we can zoom in. Okay, we can zoom into that specific section, whether it's a database health or a replica health. Okay, and again, most cases it starts off from the database. Okay, and then it will roll up to the replica, and then it will roll up to the availability group in general. Okay, but this is not about us looking at the dashboard. This episode, and the topic for this episode is not about looking at the dashboard. The purpose of this is to not blindly trust the always on availability group dashboard. Okay, why is that? Because there are certain things that the dashboard is telling you, but may or may not be helpful for you. For one, the dashboard is not real time. Okay? The dashboard is not real time. In fact, by default, if I'm not mistaken, a 5-minute interval. The dashboard, if you open up the dashboard, you connect to the primary replica, it will refresh the data within 5 minutes. Within 5 minutes, which means there might be some issues happening, a couple of seconds after the last refresh of the data, but it's not displaying it on the dashboard. In fact, this is something that I show whenever I do my always-on availability groups, the Senior DBA's Ultimate Field Guide training class, is I will showcase the dashboard while an application is running in the background, or foreground, background. The dashboard is in the background, and then an application is running, and then the application is connected to the database inside the availability group. The application would freeze as a side effect of something going on inside the AG, like it was disconnected. It will report that there is an issue with the AG because I had it throw an error regarding connectivity, and because it's connecting to the listener name, the fact that it could not connect to the listener name means there's an issue with the AG. However, the dashboard is still showing all greens until the next data refresh, which is, again, a 5-minute interval. I only changed the frequency of the dashboard to refresh the data on refresh frequency for like 30 seconds or 5 seconds when I'm doing presentations, something like this, okay? But not in day-to-day operations, because it will run queries in the background, and you don't want to be hitting the databases with queries or probing queries for health just so you can see while you're looking at it. Okay? Again, the dashboard is not real time, and I certainly do not recommend tweaking SQL Server Management Studio to pull the data, okay, on like every 5 seconds. Okay? Keep the defaults as it is, because the dashboard is not meant to be used for monitoring. Okay? And again, the dashboard is not meant to be used for monitoring. That's why you don't trust the dashboard blindly, because it's not reporting real time. The second reason for this is that green does not automatically mean healthy. Like I said, with a 5-minute refresh interval, SQL Server Management Studio might have already pulled the SQL Server metadata about the AG, and then the minute that it starts pulling, displays the data as healthy, something happened to the AG. And again, the example that I mentioned earlier is whenever I do this demo for my customers, is they see the app because they're interacting with the app, and all of a sudden the app no longer responds, it can no longer connect to the database, it freezes as a side effect of the AG being offline. However, because the dashboard only picks up the data, or the metadata, every 5 minutes, it's not going to show them immediately. We have to wait for a couple of minutes. In my case, what I'll do is I will tweak the frequency down to around 3 minutes in time for me to introduce some issues to the AG, the application to freeze right in front of them seeing that there's discrepancy between what the dashboard is saying versus what is actually happening. So green does not automatically mean healthy. There might be issues with the failover cluster infrastructure, with Active Directory that is causing issues, or DNS that's causing issues, and it's not showing. Okay, it's not showing in here. In fact, I had one case where the dashboard was showing all greens, but applications could not connect to it, mainly because there was a DNS problem. Okay, keep in mind your listener name is a DNS record. Client applications connect to the listener name via DNS, meaning they would look up the listener name through the DNS. The DNS server will serve them the corresponding virtual IP before they can even connect to the availability group. But in this case, it was an issue with the listener name that is not reflected inside the dashboard, okay? Because it's simply a DNS record. So the client application could not connect to the listener name as a DNS issue, but the dashboard does not show that. Okay? It's not going to show that. Okay? So green does not automatically mean healthy. There might be issues happening underneath, under the covers, that are outside of SQL Server that are affecting applications connecting to the availability group, but is not being displayed on the dashboard. That doesn't mean that the dashboard was not written properly. It's just that the dashboard was not meant to be a monitoring tool. Okay? Again, emphasizing the fact that the dashboard was not designed and meant to be a monitoring tool. The third one is this: synchronized does not mean fast failover. And this, again, go back to what I mentioned earlier. You can tweak the data that you would see in the dashboard, meaning the columns. You can add or remove columns. But, you know, I like the fact that when you open up the dashboard, it's all green. It gives you this, you know, false sense of security sometimes. But you can add and remove columns. The thing here is this: it's interesting to see that I have the synchronization state column beside your replicas. So you got like group by, you have your name, your replica, and then your synchronization state. The synchronization state will tell you whether or not the primary is synchronized with the secondary. Okay, primary is synchronized with the secondary. And the way this works is that, think of it as a two-phase commit. Okay, two-phase commit meaning if I submit a transaction to the database, the primary replica will persist the data first on the primary database, but it's not the data in the way we understand it. It first has to generate corresponding transaction log records from that transaction, writes those transaction log records onto the LDF file of the primary database. That's the first phase, okay, of the two-phase commit. First phase is write the LDF file onto the, or write the transaction log records onto the LDF file of the primary database, sends it over the wire, over the network, to the secondary replica. The secondary replica will then write those log records onto its own LDF file. Once it's written those LDF files, or LDF records, I'm mixing things, transaction log records onto the secondary database's LDF file, the secondary replica will then send an acknowledgement message back to the primary replica saying, I'm good. So that's phase 2 of the two-phase commit. So synchronized only means that the log records have been written to disk on the corresponding LDF file of the secondary database. Now, here's the thing. That doesn't mean that those records have already been redone on the secondary database. Part of what the availability group is doing is running redo. It is replaying all committed transactions, in this case because the transaction has already been written to the LDF file of the secondary database. That is considered to be a committed transaction. Okay? Part of the ACID property of the database. It's the consistency and durability property of relational databases. So the transaction log records corresponding to that transaction has already been written to the LDF file of the secondary database. That is considered to be a committed. I want to use the air quotes that you can see on camera. It's considered to be committed because anything that happens to the secondary database, it can retrieve those transaction log records, replay those committed transactions, and keep the data consistent. Okay? Synchronized inside SQL Server Management Studio's availability group dashboard does not mean that the data on the primary is exactly the same as the data in the secondary, because writing transaction log records on disk is just the first part. The second part is the redo that I mentioned earlier, the redo process. This redo process happens as SQL Server will read the corresponding transaction log records, generates the corresponding internal transactions to persist those data onto the MDF file, or the data file. Okay? This is what it means to be truly synchronized. The data that we know of as humans, the readable data, is exactly the same as what's on the primary, and that's what's on the secondary. But from SQL Server's point of view, the data internally is consistent, meaning the data on the primary will look exactly like the data on the secondary the moment the SQL Server finishes the whole failover process. Okay? And the redo could be blocked by so many different things. It could be blocked by read-only workloads on the secondary replica, so the failover might not happen fast. That's what I mean by when I said synchronized, looking at the synchronization state column over on the right side of the replica name, does not necessarily mean when I initiate a failover, it's going to happen fast. Okay, it's going to happen fast. It's also one of the reasons why, and I've seen this as a question on Stack Exchange the other day, where somebody was asking, hey, our secondary replica is simply for disaster recovery. Can we provision an underpowered replica? And the answer is yes, you can, but you're also putting your database synchronization at risk. Okay? You're putting your database synchronization at risk because the amount of time it takes to write the transaction log records on disk on the secondary replica will all depend on how fast your I/O subsystem, how much compute resources you have on the secondary, and of course, distance between the primary and the secondary. So just because you see synchronized under synchronization state doesn't mean fast failover. Okay. Another thing here is that because you might have a replica there that is considered with async commit, okay, asynchronous commit, it will never be synchronized even if there's nothing going on there. Okay, even if there's nothing going on there, it will never be synchronized, and that's just by design. Okay? But sometimes people get confused because when they look at it, like, wait a second, it says green, but it says synchronizing. Okay, it will never be synchronized because by design, the failover cluster will choose not to fail over to that replica where the databases are configured to be in asynchronous commit mode. Okay. Didn't I say earlier that the dashboard is not meant to be a monitoring tool? Okay. And this is the thing, though. This is just the starting point for monitoring, but this is not the ultimate monitoring. In fact, I would doubt that when you build an always-on available group, you'll be sitting on your desk like this whole day, every day, 9 to 5, watching the dashboard. No, you're not going to be doing that because it's a complete waste of your time. What you would do is come up, install, and configure a monitoring tool that you would configure in a way to watch what is happening within your availability group infrastructure. Okay? Not the dashboard. Okay? The dashboard is just there to validate things when you get an alert that something is wrong and use this to validate. Okay? That's why, again, you don't trust the always-on availability groups dashboard blindly. And I think I repeated it a couple of times. The dashboard is not designed and meant to be a monitoring tool. It's meant to be a validation tool. Okay, it's interesting because I've seen DBAs where they would add a column onto the dashboard where it will report the recovery point and recovery time. Well, not recovery point, recovery time, but mostly log send queue, log send rate, redo queue, and redo rate. They would add it to the dashboard as they're looking at it. Well, for one, that's also not real time. To the first point I mentioned, that's also not real time. It will grab data from the replica that it is on. And besides, the replica that it is on will be the primary replica. It is not going to report the secondary replica when it comes to redo queue and redo rate, because that's on the secondary. Okay? And I've seen database administrators who would have those columns on a dashboard. Again, the availability group dashboard, beautiful. Kudos to the team that built it. Beautiful and useful as it is. It was not designed to be a monitoring tool. It was designed to be a validation tool, so you can see what's going on. Okay, that's why you don't blindly trust the always-on available group dashboard. You need to implement a proper monitoring tool to capture issues, not when something is already happening, you log on and you check. Besides, I did say that the available group dashboard, the one that you saw with all the greens and all, is only available on the primary replica. What happens if you lose your AG, meaning you have a failover cluster losing quorum, taking the availability group offline with it, there's nothing to access. Sure, you will be able to connect to the SQL Server instance using SQL Server Management Studio, but you will never be able to open up the dashboard because there's no AG. And if that's the case, you shouldn't be using the dashboard at that point, okay? Because there's no way to validate. You should be looking at things outside of it. Again, the dashboard is not meant as a substitute to a real-time monitoring solution. Tools like Redgate, SQL Monitor, that you can use to monitor your always-on available groups. And I maybe it's just me. Customers would spend, very expensive on licensing, a lot of money on buying very expensive licensing, on a very expensive hardware as well and not have a real-time monitoring tool, it blows my mind. It's like driving a very, very, very expensive Ferrari and you're not even taking care of it. So please make sure that you have a proper monitoring tool in place that you can use to monitor your available groups real time. Right? That is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Tune in again next week for another episode. And if you do need help with anything related to SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery solutions, or specifically just always on availability groups, reach out. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and let's have that conversation. If there's anything I can do to help, I will. If not, I will steer you in the direction that would help serve you best. This would lead you, by the way, to my calendar page where you can pick and choose a time that works for you. And the way the strategy sessions work is we're going to be doing two things. One, we're going to get clear on what the real issue is. Are you trying to build an availability group? Are you trying to figure out what the problem is because it's causing issues? We'll get clear on the real issue is. And then the second part is coming up with a strategy to make sure that we will resolve those issues. Because what's the point of having a strategy if you're not going to be using the strategy and not resolving those issues? Again, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and happy to help in any way I can. That is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Enjoy the rest of your week and the rest. I don't know, I like calling Thursdays the start of my weekend. I want long weekends. I'll see you again in the next episode.